move on to the next slides, we now have Alethea from CISA. We've overcome our technical difficulties. So I really wanted you to hear from her. So I want to go back to the question I had asked before and asked Alethea to give CISA's perspective. You know, through the National Risk Management Center, of which she is a part, they work with government and industry to identify, analyze, prioritize, and manage the most significant strategic risks to the nation's critical infrastructure. Something I think all of you would be very interested in. So Alethea, if you could tell us what are the key motivators, reasons, and barriers, the challenges for developing these public-private relationships within the cyber community to ensure effective risk management programs.
Thanks, Barbara. Just confirming, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, well, good evening, everybody. Apologies for the technical issues just now. But to answer your question, there are several critical motivators or reasons for developing this public-private relationships. I'm going to touch upon two items. The first being data sharing. A better developed relationship between the public and private sector we find leads to deeper sharing of data for a variety of purposes, including but not limited to defensive cyber operations, offensive cyber operations, emerging and ongoing cyber incidents, and in rare but critical cases, cyber incidents that lead to the loss of life. In the case of the private sector, this can also be an opportunity for them to access classified information otherwise unavailable. The second reason I would touch upon is incident response. As sophisticated cyber attacks continue to ramp up, a developed private and public relationship allows for faster and more effective incident response. So having those trusted contacts already in place allows us, the United States government, to obtain information needed pertaining to the ongoing or the emerging incident. So those are kind of the two critical motivators. There are also additional barriers or challenges for developing this relationship. I'll touch upon two more. Sensitivity issues is one. So frequently, both the public and private sector, they deal with sensitive information that has a variety of restrictions in terms of sharing. It makes collaborating really difficult on our end. So as part of CISA's, what we call the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative Project, we work to ensure relevant information is at the appropriate classification and sensitivity levels for all participating partners. Lastly, the other challenge is the partnerships with small and medium-sized organizations. So outreach and accessibility to the massive and diverse critical infrastructure community can oftentimes be difficult. But at CISA, we are working to leverage relationships with our industry leaders, interagency, our sector risk management agencies, state, local, tribal, territorial. We're working the gambit to amplify these messages and recommendations for effective cyber defense.
That's very helpful. Thank you so much for sharing that. I've gone back now to the 55 national critical functions slide, and so if you would like to just briefly, Matt talked about it from a general perspective, but if you could give us some more of CISA's perspective, that would be great.
Sure. Let me see. We're on slide 21. Okay. So guiding most of our analytical work here at the National Risk Management Center is understanding the risk through the lens of the National Critical Function. So I'm going to call it NCFs. You can see that's the definition of it. Back in the spring of 2019, just kind of give you a little background, we published what we call this 55 national critical functions. But again, this is a living thing, so don't hold short of just 55. It's ongoing, it's developing. And we coordinated this with government and private sector partners, industry, and a lot of stakeholders. So central to this effort was understanding, so what functions are so vital, if disrupted or sabotaged, will cause cross-sector impacts on nationwide degradation. So examples of this national critical functions, think of electricity generation that powers our home, transportation of food or gas because we all need food, and access to data for using our phones. So think of any interruption to one of these NCFs that can have a cascading consequence across industries and society. So this framework itself that we publish, we focus on the functions, the key assets, systems, and networks that support them, as well as the critical technologies and dependencies that enable them. So essentially, it's less about who you are, but more about the functions you produce and enable on. So what we look at is by identifying where these key dependencies or interdependencies lies, we are able to analyze, prioritize, and manage systematic risks that have cascading impacts within or across the sectors, and therefore impact multiple organizations and operations. And the last point is I wanted to kind of emphasize also was we leveraged this framework in response to emerging threats. So to give you kind of two examples, Hurricane Dorian was an incident. We used the National Critical Function Framework. We applied it to understanding geographically distributed. So anything outside of the area of storm, what were the impacts from the hurricane? And another scenario we used this was in support of COVID-19 incident response activities. We leveraged the national critical functions and we developed a forecast of risks to NCFs looking 60 days out into the future. So those are kind of like a very top level of how we use national critical functions at the National Risk Management Center for that kind of guide analytical work. So Barbara, that concludes my portion.
Well, thank you very much. I'm glad that we got your perspective. I think that added a whole bunch of texture and context that we were missing on that. Let me now that we've been able to catch up with you on that, let us go now. And I'd like to turn back to Matt to talk about creating a risk register and what that is. Matt?
All right, thank you. So we did spend some time talking about mission analysis, crown jewel analysis, and thank you for that broader explanation of the managing it through critical functions. What we're going to do now is we're going to kind of get a little lower into a level of detail because the goal is to identify the risks to our missions or those critical services that come from a variety of sources. So let's dig down one layer and start looking at some of the risks associated with each of these. As Barbara mentioned earlier before the break, these include intentional attacks. We can think of network attacks, ransomware attacks, terrorism or hacktivists, or some of these unintentional events, employee error, hardware and mechanical failure. We have issues with environmental disasters and just general environmental conditions with heat and moisture in a lot of our systems. The bullets on the bottom of the slide here are a few specific examples of some of these risks as we work through identifying risks for missions and some of these critical services. So for example, a ransomware attack might prevent access to the system and its contents. And we've seen that a lot over the summertime, really, of 2021 as a key technique for global cyber crime. Another one, an insider threat copies the system's data and shares it with a cyber threat actor. Again, there's many instances of this, and this is a risk that we're going to have to capture and do some analysis of to try to mitigate or completely eliminate it. And again, speaking with environmental, the example here is excessive rainfall and flooding destroys data centers in the southern provinces. And of course, there was several months in the past few years where that's continuously been problematic. And we have to worry about those risks just as much as these cyber threat actors, because it'll lead to a denial of service and a denial of the ability to provide those critical functions to the government. So we want to collect and identify all of these risks to those missions and services, and what we're going to use is a risk register. A risk register, what it is, it contains all the collection of information on the identified cyber risks. And additionally, it complies to the risk management principles in the Cybersecurity Act. So let's look at a sample slide of a risk management register or risk register. Let's go to the next one. And we kind of have a spreadsheet here. Hopefully you can read the syntax in there. And what I want to do is I want to highlight a few fields in this risk register template. Maybe specifically, let's take a look at the top 5. We're going to start at the top with the unique identifier. The risk register, if you think about how is this implemented, is likely maintained in a spreadsheet or a database. So it's important to have them quickly retrievable with some unique field or a key. Moving down, you see the risk description. Of course, that's exactly what it sounds like. It's a description of the risk, but really in a short, easily understandable phrase. For example, there's an example of one I would put: remote access to database management. Since we know there's inherent risks anytime we enable remote access to a critical system. Again, lots of examples historically dating a few years back with the Ukraine electric system. Next, going down is the risk owner. It's important, almost to say the most critical, to identify who's responsible for mitigating or accepting that risk listed in the register. Because again, with the limited resources, sometimes you always want to reduce the risk of reduce the risk with mitigation measures, but there are times where you just don't have the resources available, and sometimes you will have to accept the risk. So who makes that decision and who is responsible for mitigating it if it's one of the high priority items? Going down a little bit, the system category would be used to identify the critical infrastructure sector perhaps, and the overall risk entry is a result of that previous ranking of criticality levels that we talked about. We see down the list of items, see there's an entry for expected outcomes. This is the worst case result. If the risk is realized, in there you said, okay, what is the worst case analysis? And also an entry for mitigation measures that have already been taken. I want to explain the rest of the columns. If you move over to the columns on the right, you'll see risk 1, risk 2, and risk 3, because multiple entries are possible in each row, because there could be several risks associated with one particular risk description. Let me give you an example, like exactly what I'm talking about. So if we had a remote access enabled system, like I mentioned, the risk could include, under risk 1, weak encryption. That could be a risk. The second one could be denial of service, because then the person can't remotely manage it. Or a third one could even be physical access to that human that is the administrator. So you may have multiple risks, and that's why there's several columns there. So we can just see in the short introduction of the risk register that the quality and completeness of the risk register is an important component in our planning and our execution of that risk management process. So Barbara, I'll pass it back to you and to talk about how you discuss that risk evaluation and then dig into threats a little bit.
Thank you, Matt. So let me talk a little bit about an overview of the risk evaluation process. So as I mentioned earlier, risk is a function of the threat, vulnerability, and consequences. Thus, evaluation of possible risks require assessing each of these aspects of risk. So the steps in the risk evaluation process include threat assessments, vulnerability assessments, the consequences or impact measurement, and then you use the threat and vulnerability results to create a likelihood score. You put the likelihood score and consequences together, and you can create an overall risk score. So let's go through that process so we can help you understand the various steps and what's required. So a threat assessment is the process of formally evaluating the nature and degree of threat. So the intended outcome is to establish a threat score. Now, there is not a single format or way to do a threat assessment, but there are certain elements that should be in each threat assessment. A description of the nature of the threat, including the target of the threat, identification of the type of threat actor, evaluation of the threat actor's intent, An evaluation of the threat actor's capabilities and, if possible, the known tactics, techniques, and procedures typically used by the threat actor. And these assessments are a key element of assessing risks, which are also required in the Cybersecurity Act. Now, you might be asking, how can I possibly know what the threats are? And this is where cyber threat intelligence becomes very important. Cyber threat intelligence, or CTI, can take many forms and come from many sources. Here I've included just a couple examples. One could be internal information. You have your own analysis of successful and failed intrusions on your own systems. That's cyber threat intelligence. There could be government information, open and closed resources, some that's open to the public and some that are only for particular organizations. There's open source intelligence, or OSINT, which could be blogs or threat feeds or academic papers or even Mitre attack. Or you could have paid subscription services and feeds, FireEye, CrowdStrike, many others can give you that kind of information. So there's lots of different sources. If I can, let me turn to Alethea, who can give us some examples of CTI that CISA can provide publicly.
Okay. So this is an example of something that we pushed out, and it's the type of information that CISA makes publicly available. And also, I talked about the national critical functions, as you can see about right there. This is how we apply the national critical functions in action. So these are some of the visual graphics that we push out. Sometimes the last one we did was a joint announcement with FBI, and we put out a visual infographic too. So the different kinds of varieties of information we push out. But I strongly encourage everyone to check out our website. It's www.cisa.gov, where we routinely publish resources on a variety of topics. We publish information on ransomware, even ways to kind of keep yourself cyberspace, how to report incident, whether it's phishing attempts, malware, and vulnerabilities. And then we have other training resources that some kindergarten, high school folks also utilize. The last point is you can subscribe via social media. We're on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, or you can email, or if you want to subscribe through email, you can go through our website and you can stay on top of any breaking news and information that we push out daily about our mission areas. So that's some way of kind of keeping informed of what we do and any critical vulnerabilities, anything that we want to push out to share with the public. So I offer that. Thank you, Barbara.
Well, thank you. And I think that that's helpful, knowing that there's those kinds of resources that are available to anybody around the world who wants to find more of that kind of threat information. But again, as with everything in cybersecurity, there's always too much. And so in terms of CTI, there's always too much available. And so you have to make choices. And so this particular slide is talking about the three different sort of categories of CTI information. There's adversary information, there's technology data, and there's asset information. And we sort of have that triangle in the middle that if you can find CTI feeds or sources of information that can cover all three of those are going to be your most valuable sources of information to create your threat assessment. At this point, we would like to return to Mentimeter and ask you two more questions. Whether your organization has a cyber threat intelligence program, and do you know the sources of your cyber threat intelligence? If we can, I think in the chat is the code for you to go back, if you can want to go back and see.
Thanks, Barbara. So our responses are coming in. It looks like so far, yes, encouraging there are CTI programs in place, and the sources of that intelligence are known. If anyone is willing to maybe put something in the chat and note the sources that are your go-to or that are the most used, whether that's open source, vendor, blogs, particular sources that that you have found useful. That could be a piece of information that your colleagues on the line would be interested in. It looks like we have about 20% right on the nose who may not have a program or may not know what sources are being used. So this would be a great opportunity for those of you that have that information on hand to share, if you're willing to put some of those notes in the chat. We'll keep this open. Let's see if anyone was willing to come back to our session and note their go-to sources that might be useful to other colleagues. We still have some responses coming in, but slowing down a little bit.
I'll go ahead and make a quick comment while we're waiting for those to come in, because one of the stats that's popping up here is really is a great indicator that everyone that generally knows about the cyber threat program knows the sources of it. So that's a really great indicator that as far as your cyber threat assessments, the quality or really where your information is coming helps you understand how accurate it is and if you're getting it from quality sources. So the fact that these bar graphs are equal across is a very positive indication for the cyber response teams.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we'll continue to get responses there, but why don't we go back to the use of the CTI that you gather? And if we can come back to talking about identifying the threat actor's intent levels. So there's two aspects of a threat actor you want to assess: the threat actor's intent and their capability. So let's first look at intent levels. Now, on the left-hand column, we have different intent levels that sort of have a subtitle to them. So, for example, very high intent means they're very focused. They have a primary aim to attack the system or service. They will probably be known hostile foreign intelligence services. There's evidence the threat actor has undertaken detailed research and really knows your system and is going to spend a lot of time. In fact, it may be years that they're willing to work in order to do that. The next level is high, meaning they're committed. They will be persistent and frequent and continuing to come back. Medium means they're interested. If they have an opportunity, they will look at it. They might come back frequently, but they're not going to spend the same kind of resources and time. And then you get down to the very low indifferent. They are not going to be doing the kinds of things that the very high focus kind are. But it's important to understand the intent levels to know how persistent the threat actor is going to be. Because if they are more persistent and have a higher level of intent, you're going to be more concerned about them. The second aspect is looking at their capability levels. And this is figuring out whether they actually can follow through on the intent. So if you have someone who would love to attack your system, but they don't have the capability, they are going to be less of a concern for you. And so again, we have here 5 levels. These levels are not required. Everyone doesn't have to have the same 5 levels, but this is a sample of how we've used them. And then having criteria for what it is. So for example, formidable means the threat actor is extremely capable and well-resourced, such as a foreign intelligence service. They can devote several man-years to it. They can develop and target specific attacks. They can coordinate information. They can cultivate insiders. They can use large amounts of equipment. And this is versus someone who has little or very little, where they have very modest capabilities and resources, such as, they talk about sort of the kid in the basement. And so understanding who your threat actors are and what capabilities they are key to finding out and coming up with the threat score. And so when you have the threat score, when you have intent and capability, you can develop a relative score to prioritize specific threats. As you can see in the upper right-hand corner, if you've got a formidable threat actor who has lots of resources and they have a very high level of intent, that is a critical threat actor with whom you need to really spend your resources. You will never have enough resources to deal with every kind of threat actor. So you really want to use this threat level scoring to make sure that you understand where you can put your limited resources. And again, these assessments are a means to comply with the risk management principles contained in the Cybersecurity Act. But that threat level scoring helps you rate various threat actors, and so you can decide who you need to really focus on. At the same time that you're doing a threat level scoring, you can also be doing a vulnerability assessment. And let me turn to Matt now, who can talk to us about vulnerability assessment process.
All right, thank you. So we've been looking at cyber risk as a function of threat, vulnerability, and consequences. So let's take a look in a little more detail at how we assess vulnerabilities, because we'll take what we just covered in threat assessments and use our vulnerability assessments to help us create that overall risk score. Our goal in these assessments is going to be to establish vulnerability ratings. This will help the decision makers to better know where to allocate those limited resources and where to best focus attention to reduce risk to those critical public services. There's a few different terms when talking about vulnerability assessments that are important to consider. A general vulnerability assessment is a process of discovering and cataloging as many vulnerabilities in a system as possible. Because if a threat actor can find the vulnerabilities, it's much better if we can find them first. Then we can take action, try to do some mitigation. Now, we could also get a bit more aggressive in our vulnerability assessments and transition into a penetration test. This is a process where security testers actually attempt to exploit those vulnerabilities to better understand how threat actors might attack the networks. The most detailed of these may include a complete security audit. So now, on top of vulnerabilities and pen testing, you can include in your analysis the corporate policies and procedures, what are the legal concerns, and also those of other countries, because we quickly cross borders, the human resources concerns, and of course, physical security, the protection of those systems. In any of these types of assessments, we've listed here a few essential elements. First, what vulnerabilities can be found based on known vulnerabilities in our applications, our networking, and other software that we can find with scanners and existing databases, maybe public resources. Most of the known vulnerabilities will have published mitigation measures to either remove the vulnerability completely or mitigate it. And of course, this is a continuous process. Next, there's system changes or activity in our systems that may be the result of threat activity. This will involve both traffic and log analysis. Finally, what processes are in place to manage both known and unknown vulnerabilities? We're used to this process where we have a Patch Tuesday every month, right, from companies like Microsoft. We get our Java updates or our PDF updates. There's a continuous process to where vulnerabilities are found and vulnerabilities are patched, and how do we close that gap as soon as possible? Because it's kind of a race. When you publish a vulnerability, you don't just publish it to the defenders. The attackers also get these vulnerabilities and quickly try to reverse engineer them. So it's a race in your process to close vulnerabilities before they're exploited. Can I go to the next slide, please? There's a lot of resources available to the vulnerability assessment team to research these known system vulnerabilities. There's a few listed on this slide as a starting point, but your technical team, they'll eventually develop a much more robust list of resources. Some of the public resources, the feeds that you want to follow, and maybe put them in a folder where you have your known resources to check those daily, because these emerging threats are consistent. The most important notes with these resources is that this is a process, is continuous, and sometimes it evolves very rapidly. So checking your key data feeds is really a daily task, because again, the recent discovered and published vulnerabilities are research for us and the threat actors, because they can use that for targeting. Basically getting the vulnerability information at the same time as we do. So it's consistently a race to defend before the attack. This is why it's also difficult in resources to defend everything, because that subject matter expertise can't cover that entire risk register and all of the known vulnerabilities in the ranked missions and services. So it's a very difficult, fast-moving process. I have a few bullets here. Some of the key resources are the U.S. National Vulnerability Database, and you can get to that from nist.gov. Of course, Mitre's Common Vulnerability and Exposure List. You can get that from mitre.org. And then, of course, U.S. Cert from CISA.gov. Notice here that the one I actually listed is U.S. Cert for Industrial Control Systems. There's a whole separate section because this is designed specifically for use by the critical infrastructure sectors, and will include some things that you normally wouldn't see at the original U.S. Cert. That includes operational technology and some of those lower level components, field devices, programmable logic controllers. So these are so definitely some of the top resources that you can continuously track to make sure you're trying to keep pace with these known vulnerabilities. Let's go to the next slide. Yeah, and there's backwards one. I think we went too far. Yeah, there's also many good resources when you're designing practices and policies for your vulnerability assessment program. The first one here is the Technical Guide to Information Security Testing and Assessments from NIST. I think this is really the foundational document that lays out areas for vulnerability assessments. As listed here, you can see there's three broad categories: reviews, target identification and analysis, and validation techniques. This guide covers in detail the essential elements I mentioned, like log analysis, network traffic monitoring, vulnerability scanning, and penetration testing. Other great resources come from the U.S. critical infrastructure sectors, and I included two here. You'll see the first one is the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and the next one is from NERC, which is the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. Both of these are excellent examples of sector-specific requirements for cyber risk analysis and vulnerability assessments, and it lays out the minimum regulatory requirements across the specific sectors. Finally, there's a lot of commercial open source tools that can be leveraged to both develop vulnerability assessment programs and execute vulnerability assessments on a regular basis. Some of the larger scale ones, such as the Nexus, Greenbone Security Manager, And some of these smaller scale scanners that you can use on your own with specific Linux distributions and different Nmap scanning engines, some of these tools that you might be familiar with. So there's a lot of open source tools if the other large scale vulnerability assessment tools aren't really feasible at the time. Go to the next slide, please. At some point, it's important to establish a methodology or some kind of system to score vulnerabilities. This is going to be based on how likely they are to be exploited. So if you can see on the table, it's a simple chart with 5 levels. This particular chart is used to score vulnerabilities that could be exploited by intentional actors. These are the vulnerabilities that we've discovered in the vulnerability assessment process. We've decided that there is some threat, whether it's highly likely, not likely, or not probable, but we've ranked those. But these are some that could be exploited by those intentional cyber threat actors that we think would have interest in our critical infrastructure sector. The higher the likelihood that a threat actor could be successful and take advantage of the vulnerability, the higher it's scored in the chart. So this is the vulnerability exists, the threat actor has the intent, and the threat actor has the capability. You can see an example at the highest level. If you look up there, there's a vulnerability that a threat actor could exploit successfully almost all of the time. So that of course would be the worst case scenario. The vulnerability exists. There's probably an exploit already developed for it. The malicious or cyber actor would like to do it. So the probability is this is going to happen any opportunity they have. So that's the highest ranking on this chart. It's an example of very likely. And as we go down, the probability of success decreases as you go down in each row. And then we look at the bottom, very low probability of success or low probability of a compromise. So that may not get some resources. It may not get the attention of your vulnerability assessment teams or those that are looking through your network for those indicators of compromise. And that shows that there is some traffic. It's important to remember, too, that it's not only the traffic coming into your network, but what is leaving your network or possibly being exfiltrated or moved in the other direction. So that analysis has to go both ways. This chart is for intentional actors. Now let's follow up with the next one. And there we go. So this one is for unintentional events, not necessarily exploits, but some kind of event. It's similar to the previous scoring system, but notice that this system is based on vulnerabilities that may be exploited unintentionally. We recall a few examples of unintentional vulnerabilities. These can include employee errors. This has a lot to do with training. You know, it's difficult to keep up every time we upgrade a piece of software, or what are the processes? Can I use external drives? Can I have remote access? The employee training is very difficult to keep up with. So that is going to require a lot of resources. And every time there's new folks, this is another evolving situation. You could have hardware failure, power outages, and some extreme weather events. We understand that both our information technology systems and those operational technology systems are so complex that there may be situations that could cause disruption in service that aren't even related to cyber threat actors. You'll notice in this example, we have 4 vulnerability levels. And the scoring for intentional actors in the previous one, we had 5. So this just illustrates that the scoring system is going to be completely different from intentional vulnerabilities and unintentional vulnerabilities that could cause events or disruption of services. The criteria here is a bit different as well, as the unintentional vulnerabilities are closely linked to planning and preparation. We can think of examples. Let's go back to flooding, right? The planning for flooding, planning for power surges, and even a spike in the required services due to the global pandemic, right? Due to COVID-19, we have a huge spike in the healthcare sector, which we probably couldn't have predicted a few years ago. Same thing with the distribution. So as much planning there can be put into these unintentional vulnerabilities that we might have due to these geographical events or due to just global events, the better it is. So the criteria is quite different. And I also mentioned employee training has a big impact on the vulnerability scoring for unintentional cyber vulnerabilities. I think we're getting close to the top of the hour, but I'm going to pass this back to Barbara and see if we're going to go to break or we're going to move to the next piece. You hear me okay?
Sorry. Am I back on now, Matt?
Yes, thanks. I was wondering if I was on.
Nope, that was me. So we had talked about the whole risk evaluation process, and we talked about doing the threat assessment and coming up with a score for the threat assessment. Then we talked about vulnerability assessments and coming up with a score for that. But then what we need to calculate is a likelihood level. So how do we establish a value for how likely a particular risk is to occur? Now, it would be nice if there was some simple formula and we could just say, well, X times Y equals answer, but that's not the way it goes. It really is a judgment call based on combined judgments regarding the level of threat and vulnerability. It's important to know there's no determined relative value for threat versus vulnerability. The combined judgment should reflect both the level of the relative scores and the confidence in the basis for the scores. Thus, a very high threat score based on confirmed intelligence may influence the overall judgment more than a low vulnerability score. In another case, a high vulnerability score reflecting clearly identified vulnerabilities may be more important than a lower threat score that is based on weaker information. Some examples of sort of the levels that we might use is very likely, likely, medium, unlikely, or very unlikely. The other piece that we need to look at is estimating the consequences or the impact. So the intended outcome is to establish a score for the possible consequences if a threat actor successfully exploits a vulnerability. And so, for example, if you've got something that is only going to cause minor problems or minor consequences, if it in fact occurs, you're not going to spend your resources trying to avoid that. You're going to spend it on the things that are going to be the most critical consequences or severe consequences. Importantly, when you look at consequences and impact, you're going to look at it based on your missions. And we keep coming back to the missions. So that earliest step of figuring out what your missions are is really important. This particular chart is just a sample of what one might look like. The elements of consequences aligned to missions in the left-hand column completely depend on what you're looking at, services or processes or systems, and what your missions and align to your particular missions. So the examples we give might be that the service or system unavailability or degradation increases the risk to public safety. If it does that and it, for example, led to the loss of multiple lives, that would be a critical level of consequences or impact. Or a loss of a single life might be severe, widespread major injuries might be significant, widespread minor injuries might be moderate, minor injuries be minor. And you can go through each of those particular elements of the consequences and set up criteria across each of these so that you can make a determination of what the consequences or impact might be. It is certain that you cannot make these to be specific. And so these are just categories that can give you a relative sense of, if this were to happen, would the outcomes be really bad? Or is it something that you just don't have the time or resources to worry about? So when you put all these things together, you can then come up with the overall risk score. And the intended outcome of this step is to calculate the relative risk score for the evaluated risks. So if you look at this particular chart, you can see how all the pieces we've talked about come together into a single score. On the left-hand side is that likelihood score that we talked about, which is based on threat and vulnerability. So you've come up with those categories of whether it's very likely, likely, medium, unlikely, or very unlikely. And then you have across it is consequences severity. And again, you put it in that category. And so you can then figure out where in your overall risk score are the things you should worry the most about. And obviously, the very likely events that can cause very severe consequences are going to be critical or severe. And those are the ones where you want to put your resources. Now, these scores are not going to be precise. You can't say one is 11.2 and one is 12.5. The point of this overall risk scoring is to come up with relative values. Is this risk more severe and more likely than this other risk? And if so, the one that's more likely and going to cause more consequences is the one where I'm going to focus my resources and continue to figure out what I'm going to do about those particular ones. So let's go back to the risk register template example. And so as Matt had talked about this before, you can see in the left-hand column, there's a place for the overall risk rating. There's an overall threat rating, the vulnerability rating, the consequences rating. So this register is the place where you're going to capture all of the information that you've gotten from your various assessments. And that's one of the reasons why the risk register is a helpful place to gather all this information in one place and update it. As you remember when we talked about the process at the very beginning, how it was a cycle and how you went to the point of going and you find these answers and then you evaluate whether things are changing or not changing. So once you've got these significant resources and concerns about which threats and vulnerabilities you worry about, which risk you're going to worry about, one of the things you have to think about is, okay, can I mitigate those most severe risks and make it so that, in fact, those consequences won't occur, or in fact, the actual event won't occur because I've mitigated it. I'm showing here on this slide what has been called, from David Bianco, the pyramid of adversary pain. And what this means is there are different kinds of mitigation you can do that will have a greater impact on whether you can prevent a threat actor from exploiting vulnerabilities. And as you go up this pyramid, the examples are types of mitigations you can do that will have a longer and bigger impact. So, for example, at the bottom of the pyramid is hash values. If you change those, you are unlikely to stop the threat actor. The threat actor can easily change those it's trivial, you will probably have not mitigated your risk. The next level is to go to the IP addresses. That's probably also pretty easy for your adversary to change. And so again, doing that level of mitigation is probably not going to be successful. Changing domain names. Again, your adversary, particularly those who have a lot of intent and high capability, are going to be able to get around that. When you change network and host artifacts, it becomes annoying to the threat actor and a little bit more difficult for them. So you're going to slow them down a bit, but you're not going to stop them. Once you start going into different tools, and they would have to change the tools that they use, it becomes more challenging for them. And once you address what are their tactics, techniques, and protocols, those at that level, it becomes very tough for them to change because many of the threat actors have very specific tactics, techniques, and protocols for how they do it. In fact, if you go to the Mitre attack database, you can see with different kinds of actors, the specific kinds of TTPs that they use. And if you address those specific TTPs, you make it much more difficult for those threat actors to be successful. So if you want to think about a mitigation process, you want to think about addressing the TTPs that your threat actor is likely to use. We also know that no matter how much mitigation you do, there are going to be successful risks, that certain threat actors are going to be successful and that they are going to successfully attack your system. And that means you have to have two things ready. One is your incident response capabilities, and the other is your resiliency readiness. Now, we will talk much more in detail about this maturity model that's shown on the screen when we get to session 4. But we wanted to introduce this concept of incident response and resiliency readiness at this point because they're an important factor in your overall risk management process, because you manage risks that actually occur by making sure that you have appropriate incident response capabilities and that you also have resiliency. Again, we'll talk much more in detail about how this particular maturity model works when we get to session 4. But again, this is an important part of risk management. And the next point is managing identified risk. Now, not all risks have to be mitigated. Risks may also be accepted or transferred, and you decide how to deal with risk by evaluating the cost, the benefit, and feasibility of mitigating. For each of the evaluated risks, the risk holder must decide whether they can mitigate the risk or is willing to accept the risk or transfer the risk, such as with insurance or actions that trade risk in one area for risk in another, less important area. For mitigation, the risk holder will evaluate what actions would need to be taken to mitigate the risk, considering people, whether training or supplementing staff, process, applying security controls, or technology, segmenting a network, and the cost and feasibility of these actions compared to the potential consequences if the risk were to happen. So you're not going to spend millions of dollars or tie bots to mitigate a risk that, if it actually happened, would only cause consequences of 1,000 baht. So that's why you have to be able to figure out the cost and feasibility, and that's why you need your consequences score to understand what's worth paying the money for. If mitigation is not feasible, the risk holder must decide whether it can accept the risk or transfer it to another entity. Or if mitigation or transfer are not available, the risk holder should have a resiliency plan for recovery from the residual risk. And again, this process for addressing risks is consistent with the Cybersecurity Act. And then step 6 that we talked about in that first cycle was monitoring identified risk and next steps. So risk monitoring. What has changed in my environment? Are there new threats? Are there new vulnerabilities? Reevaluate your assumptions about whether the threat actor has that intent and capability, or whether those vulnerability levels are accurate, or the consequences are accurate. You know, perhaps it might be that now these consequences would be much greater because of climate change or some other external factor. Next is training and education, guiding the stakeholders to improve their risk management processes, including their response capabilities, and implementing resiliency activities for residual risks as needed. We've now covered a great deal of information. Let me pause for a moment and give people an opportunity to, if they have some questions. So if you in the chat want to ask some questions, or if something's not clear or you want to go over something again, please use the chat and you can raise your particular questions. And we'll give you a moment to do so. If we don't get any questions at this point in the chat, you can still do it. We're going to take a 10-minute break at this point in time. In the chat, Joanna's going to put into the chat materials for the next portion of this session. The next portion of this session is going to be a scenario with some questions that will test what we've learned during this session. And we've taken the materials, the scenario piece and the questions, and translated those into Thai. So Joanna will put into the chat where you can access the Thai version of the scenario. When we get to that particular part of this session, we hope that you will join in the chat and provide answers to the questions and make this as a conversation as much as possible. It's now, I'm going to take it up to there. It's now 11:04. So let us come back at 11:15, and then we'll go into the next portion of this session, which will be our scenario. Thank you.
Excuse me, Barbara. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Let me talk a little bit with Thai participant. I will talk in Thai.
Okay.
I will use this time to talk a little bit before the end of the session. I will talk it again.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes.
สวัสดีครับอันนี้ตอนนี้เป็นช่วงพักเบรกนะครับสำหรับการอบรมช่วงนี้นะครับแล้วก็เมื่อกี้ทางวิทยากรคุณบาบาร่านะครับได้แจ้งไว้แล้วว่าถ้าเกิดว่ามีคำถามอะไรที่ผู้แทนจากหน่วยงานนะครับต้องการสอบถามจากทางทีมวิทยากรนะครับท่านสามารถที่จะพิมพ์เข้าไปในแชทได้เลยนะครับหรือว่าจะเป็นประเด็นสงสัยประเด็นที่อยากให้เขาช่วยอธิบายเพิ่มเติมหรือว่าอยากได้อะไรนะครับก็ไม่ต้องเกรงใจนะครับสามารถที่จะพิมพ์ข้อแจ้งเข้าไปในแชทได้นะครับแล้วก็ตอนท้ายของวันนี้นะครับก็หลังจากทางทีมวิทยากรเขาได้มีการสอบถามตัวซีนาริโอที่เกี่ยวกับการบริหารความเสี่ยงซึ่งก็ขอให้ทุกท่านได้ร่วมกันแสดงความคิดเห็นอย่างเต็มที่นะครับแล้วเดี๋ยวตอนท้ายอาจจะมีเวลาสั้นๆนะครับที่ได้พูดคุยกันอีกทีหนึ่งเป็นเฉพาะฝ่ายไทยนะครับก็สรุปว่าเดี๋ยวช่วงพักเบรกนะครับท่านไหนมีประเด็นที่อยากจะ คอมเมนต์ซักถามเนื้อหาท่านสามารถใส่เข้าไปได้ในแชทเลยนะครับขอบคุณมากครับสวัสดีครับ
It's 11:15. Joanna, do you want to start with your scenario section, please?
Yes, thank you, Barbara. And my apologies for the restrictions. This is a local file. I'm not sure why it's thinking that it's linked to a SharePoint, but we will send this file via email to our hosts. There are chapters that we'll look at each evening after each session, so we'll make sure that you have access to that prior to our other sessions. And if I could invite our speakers, we are going to run this last portion of the workshop like a panel discussion. And we'll have an opportunity for you to provide some answers to some discussion questions, and also have the opportunity to interact with our speakers a bit this evening. So Alethea and Sharon Mudd from the Software Engineering Institute is also on the line with us this evening. So we will just proceed with our scenario. So we wanted to give you an opportunity to apply some of the concepts that were discussed this evening. When this is in theory and in slides, it can be a little bit difficult to kind of do that application in real time. So we wanted to give you another opportunity to think through a scenario, a situation, and then have the chance to apply some of the concepts that were discussed this evening. So I'm going to back up here just a moment. You'll see that we will do a session like this for each of our event sessions over the next 2 weeks. Starting with strategic risk management, you will learn a story about our characters. We have several characters who will deal with an issue surrounding cyber incidents that are reaching the level of national importance. And we'll walk you through that incident at that national level through each of the topics and sessions over the next 2 weeks. So today we are going to address the strategic cyber risk management portion, which was where we started this evening. So I'm going to put up our scenario here, and just for our English-speaking participants and panelists, I'm going to go ahead and just read through this quickly, make sure that we're all following our characters and the story for tonight. So here we meet our main character, one of our main characters, Mr. David Dingbang. He's a manager in the Infrastructure Security Division within the Cybersecurity Agency for the nation of Kumandra. That's our fictional nation for this session. Mr. Dingbang is responsible for interfacing with the owners and operators of critical infrastructure in the nation, and for helping to build awareness for and plan for cybersecurity and privacy programs for those organizations. So some of those organizations are privately owned, some are state-owned enterprises, many of them are multinational, but Kumandra also has a large and thriving domestic fishing and tourism industries that account for a healthy portion of their gross domestic product. This is just giving you a bit of some information about the context of this nation and what is important to them. There aren't enough hours in the day for Mr. Dingbang to connect with all of the infrastructure organizations. So he typically spends most of his time interfacing with the financial sector, especially the large multinational banks. But recently, he has been called to several meetings with health sector stakeholders because the COVID-19 pandemic spurned a rash of ransomware attacks in the sector. He is also concerned by recent press reports about malicious cyber actors that are targeting national airlines and global energy grids. Mr. Dingbang's budget has not increased in 3 years, and he is feeling overwhelmed with his duties. So, we're first going to go to Menti, and I'm going to ask for your response for our first discussion question. So the first thing we're asking is Mr. Dingbang, does he appear to be taking a strategic risk management approach to his duties? And why or why not? So thinking back to what we learned this evening, thinking about threat profile, vulnerabilities that might be in the sectors that he is responsible for, where he spends most of his time, the potential likelihood, and maybe the consequence of a risk. I'm going to ask you to take a minute and think about whether or not he is taking a strategic risk management approach to his duties. So if you could go to Menti, and you have the opportunity to type in some of your thoughts. And again, this is completely anonymous. We just like to hear your thoughts on if you think Mr. Dingbang is taking the right approach. And while we're giving the audience a moment, maybe I could ask Matt, if you wouldn't mind maybe giving some of your overall thoughts on, do you think he's being strategic enough in his approach? What do you think he could do better, or what do you think he's doing well?
Well, thank you. Yeah, I'm sure a lot of us have found ourselves in this situation, right? Under-resourced, too many responsibilities, and this is a challenge that doesn't quickly go away, especially with the evolving cyber threat field of actors. And we see that the leader that we're looking here is responsible across the infrastructure security division, responsible for all of them, but of course spending most of the time in the financial district. So when you find yourself in this very difficult situation, it gets to our initial things we talked about is, hey, am I going to take a mission-based approach and try to find out what are those crown jewels that I really need to protect, or what of those critical services? Because we see as this scenario evolves, there's really some issues with the national airlines, which could impact all kinds of things, lines of communication, tourism industry, and of course, passenger safety and the energy grid. So my initial thought is the initial reaction, as we've been in this situation, is to try to back off and look at all of the different missions and services and try to rank them and prioritize where the effort's going to be. Because at least in this scenario, to me, it doesn't seem like the priority is in the financial sector, and there's significant cyber activity with intent, threat, and capability due to COVID-19 in the health sector, and of course the energy grid there too. So that's my initial thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Would Alethea from CISA, do you have any comments on our hero here, Mr. Dingbang?
So the one thing I would harp on in this thing that kind of revealed itself is You can tell that rapid change, digitalization of the risk landscape, and gray swan events such as COVID-19. This kind of underscores why risk management is so important and difficult than ever. So I will offer that, one of the, Matt talked about some of the other aspects, but here itself, one of the things that revealed to us, put everything in focus, was that COVID-19, also outlined here, put the problem in focus. So risk management was the area of the largest increase among priorities as COVID-19 took over. So the pandemic itself revealed exactly how quickly risk can materialize. And the one thing is how interconnected things can become. So that's why, I will harp, there's so many moving parts here, but you can tell there's so many things that also interdependent in that scenario that he has to kind of tackle. But also we need to be robust enough to kind of, adapt to the volatile critical risk, because they're going to become more volatile, they're going to change significantly, they're going to become more interconnected. So that means changes in one risk will affect the impact and likelihood of many other risks. So that's a very strategic response on that scenario.
Yeah, thank you very much. And that's exactly right. And our responses that you'll see scrolling here are kind of reflecting what our panel mentioned. Overwhelming response is no, he's probably not taking a strategic approach. He hasn't really thought through maybe his threats, maybe the mission criticality, going back to what we learned about what's critical or most critical. He's maybe not looking at the threats that are being realized. Hasn't identified all of his stakeholders within his responsibility. Excellent response. He doesn't maybe know, we like to say, we don't know what we don't know. If he hasn't engaged with all of the right stakeholders, there could be some real gaps in his understanding of the scenario or of the context. So we're going to go ahead and go to our next question, and bear with me for just a moment.
And while you're doing that, Joanna, I think one of the answers I really thought was really interesting was someone said he appears to be dealing with what's in proximity. And so I think we all do. We work with those with whom it's easiest to work with. So for example, the financial sector tends to have a very good ISAC. It tends to be very threat savvy. And so it could be that it's easy to deal with them because they know what he's talking about, but it could be the other sectors who are not as sophisticated need his help more because they are not as mature as the financial sector. So I think that comment of that he's dealing with proximity as opposed to dealing with who really needs his help the most, and that's what his responsibilities are.
Excellent. Yeah, absolutely, Barbara. And we're going to, just in the interest of time, skip down to our third question, because our audience did majority agree that he's not effectively prioritizing. What changes do you think he should make? What changes? And I see a hand up. One moment, let me switch back and answer that. Yes, ma'am. Ms. Willaluk, would you like to answer?
She appears to be muted.
Okay, how about now? Is Ms. Willaluk, can you try one more time?
คุณวิไลลักษณ์ครับสามารถเปิดไมค์ได้นะครับ ตอนนี้เหมือนยังไม่ได้ยินเสียงเลยครับ
ไปกดผิดค่ะขอโทษทีค่ะ
โอเคครับ
ค่ะขอโทษค่ะ
It's mistake so you can go ahead please.
Okay, thank you. So I did have a request to go back to the scenario slide. So I will leave this up for one more moment. And we're looking at, we're going to answer the question, if he is not prioritizing his efforts, what changes should Mr. Dingbang make to his approach? So if you go to your Menti question, you should be able to answer that, but I will leave this slide up for just one more minute and give everyone a chance to absorb that information. So while we are thinking through that, Barbara, did you want to comment at all on how you see that he may want to change his approach?
Well, I think one of the answers that our participants mentioned was first figuring out who his stakeholders are and prioritizing them. And I think that that's really provides some real insight, because in the next session, tomorrow night, we are going to start with a stakeholder management type of program. And so we will get a chance to think about tomorrow night about how Mr. Dingbang could think about his stakeholders and prioritize them, and who can help him. So, for example, it might be that the financial sector is very capable and has individuals who can do a risk assessment. So maybe he can rely on them to help some of the other sectors that are not as advanced. And so I think he has to think about what resources he may have other than the resources that his office has. So it might be that other sectors can be a resource as well. So look someplace for other resources. And then among his own resources, it goes back to deciding, if you remember those charts of figuring out, okay, which risks are the ones that are most critical, the things I have to really worry about. And that's where he needs to focus those minimal resources. As we started out and we talked about why do you want to do a strategic risk management program, the very first item was because you need to figure out how to allocate your limited resources. So I think coming and thinking about the stakeholders, and then start trying to think about which risks are the ones he needs to care about most, he can then prioritize his time where he can have the most impact.
Yeah, absolutely, Barbara. And we did see one response that yes, he is taking care of the financial sector and they are the most important. And I like that answer because we know that a majority of our audience are from the financial sector. So we appreciate that perspective. And certainly to Barbara's point, the financial sector clearly is critical. And there are stakeholders in that sector that have significant importance to the national mission. But we are seeing some responses that risk assessment, when we add the qualities and the components of a risk assessment, some of those financial sector partners may not be the highest risk, even though they may be significantly important to the nation's mission. Matt, yes, go ahead.
one comment I was thinking, I'm watching the answers scroll by, and there's a real good understanding that, and again, I can feel the folks that are in this situation, that there's a lack of prioritization, figure out the risks, do the assessment, what are the consequences. I want to answer a little bit about that second part. What changes, maybe not what should he make, but what are some considerations in changing the approach? Understanding the system, understanding that, let's say that what we do eventually have the prioritization, whether it's the missions or the critical systems, ranked the risks, ranked the vulnerabilities, and decided what to spend resources on. One of the main issues in this scenario is the lack of resources. We have, maybe one person's name. Of course, it's a short paragraph, but one of the approaches is increase the resources. This kind of gets to some of the management personnel on the line, and maybe some of the critical infrastructure leadership. But one of the responsibilities of this is the manager in the infrastructure security division, is to convince the national government that in order to reduce risk, as there is that national budget allocation, the appropriations of funds, that this organization needs more resources, because even if it is properly ranked, if and only the first two things are covered, but perhaps there are 5 or 6 things at that highest level which are very critical. It's important to try to not only prioritize and use the resources where they need to be the most, but find ways to get me more resources. So that is one of the best practices in the approach, is at the same time you're using your resources to the best possible location. The leadership is trying to get more resources because the national leadership will see that this is a priority. Look what's happening at the other nation states. We know that in this scenario, COVID-19 has spawned ransomware attacks, and we need to be ready, and we can't cover all of the ground without more resources. So that's one thing I would add to my approach. Of course, if I was Mr. Dungbang, also try to get more resources. That's always a good thing.
Yeah, excellent point, Matt. Thank you. And I think, when we think of resources, the first thing that comes to mind certainly is financial resources, right? More funding for more initiatives. I think the other keenly important resource is that human capital resource, and the people who can do some of that outreach and some of that work. And that's where, being creative, looking across at other organizations who may have connection points that we can leverage, et cetera, can be a creative approach as well. And we'll talk more, and we'll get into more of some of those pieces later in our story. So I was going to call on our guest, Sharon from SCI, and Barbara, apologize, but I think she may have dropped. I'm not seeing her in our...
So Tracy indicated Sharon had to drop, but Tracy's willing to step up to the plate, so we can put Tracy in the spotlight.
Okay, let me...
Yeah, depending on the question, we have a couple of other team members on the line, depending on what's next.
Perfect. Great. Thank you, Tracy. Well, with that, how about let's go to, let me switch our screen here so we can all see what we're doing. I'm going to go to our last discussion question and give you a moment to look at that, and then we will go to, I'll give you one more minute to look at the scenario before we answer. So our last discussion question here to think about are, what immediate actions could Mr. Dingbang take to start better managing the identified risks? So immediate actions. Maybe he does go ask for more resources. Maybe he's not able to do that. What are some immediate actions that you think he could undertake to start better managing the identified risks, and just thinking about the components that we learned tonight that go into determining those risk factors and the most critical risks. So just one more moment here with the scenario. And if you are ready, you can switch over to Menti and tell us what you think. So what are some immediate actions that Mr. Dingbang can take to help address some of these risks? So Tracy, if you don't mind, what are your thoughts? What are some immediate actions you can think of you'd suggest for our hero?
This is Angel Wicker with the SEI.
Hi, Angel. How are you?
Good. How are you? And hello, everyone, all of our Thailand participants. My immediate reaction would be to have Mr. Dingbang identify the mitigation strategies for these risks that have been identified. How are we going to mitigate them? And what is it going to take to apply these mitigation strategies? Since there's a scenario where there are low resources, we'll need to go ahead and prioritize which of these vulnerabilities or these risks to resolve first. And those will be my first steps into try to resolve this situation.
Yeah, thank you, Angel. Thank you. Anyone else on the SEI team like to weigh in?
SEI team. I think that one of the things Mr. Dingbang can do, since he's in a low resource situation, it's always useful in those types of situations to explore what other colleagues in other organizations have done. It acts as sort of a force multiplier, if you will, to take advantage of what others have learned and maybe apply those in your organization.
Yeah, absolutely. Great point, Justin. And as we learn more in future sessions, we'll see how Mr. Dingbang reaches out to other colleagues to leverage what they know and what authorities and what capabilities they have. So thinking back to what we learned this evening, certainly reaching out to sources within his government who can help with some of that cyber threat intelligence to help him get a better handle on what the threat landscape actually really looks like. We learned that he read in the open source press about attacks on potential tourism, airlines, and maybe other sectors. Clearly, he knows that the health sector has a active and serious threat. But what else? What else could he do? Also, looking at the vulnerability portion of establishing risk. Starting a routine of checking those daily risk registers, having those, those daily vulnerability sources, having those kind of in his awareness as he's talking to his sector stakeholders, so he can discuss with them what he's seeing on a daily or regular basis. That's something that takes time, but doesn't take financial resources per se. It could also be something that he assigns to someone on his staff to keep him abreast of those vulnerabilities. Barbara, is there anything else that you would like to add to this kind of as we close out our discussion tonight?
Well, there's a couple things. One, I noticed that one of the responses someone put in the Mentimeter was the criticality assessments. And I really think that that has to be sort of step one, is figuring out what does he really have to worry about. And that will help prioritize. The second thing is training. He can't do everything himself. And so I think an important thing is to help others do it for themselves. He's not going to be able to do everything. So if he can do training sessions like NCSA is doing here for the critical infrastructure operators, I think it can help them, work on their problems themselves. He doesn't have to solve everybody's problems. What he needs to be is sort of the conductor who helps the orchestra know what they need to do when and where, but he doesn't have to play all the instruments. And so he has to think about, okay, how do I make sure that everyone knows what their role is and how they can do their best to help overall cybersecurity and not just be focused on their own little problems and expect Mr. Ding Bang to solve everybody's problems.
Excellent. That's absolutely right. And Alethea, if I could just ask you as well, on that topic of stakeholder engagement, certainly there could be some immediate things that Mr. Ding Bang could do to engage further with his stakeholders. To Barbara's point, he can't do everything. What do you have to say, or how would you suggest that someone with this limited time, potentially limited staff, and we know a limited budget, could do for immediate actions to get that connective tissue more in place with his critical infrastructure owners and operators? Any thoughts that you have?
The person from SEI actually had a good point, and that's kind of, don't forget, in the US, almost 80% of all critical infrastructure is owned by private sector. So the relationships you develop and these collaborations are very, very key to a successful program itself. So, and also I stressed in the word when I started off, we focus through the lens called national critical functions, C being the critical, because at the end of the day, you cannot boil the ocean, right? You can't tackle everything. So you have to kind of set your strategic priorities. And that's what we did. We set our strategic priorities across the NCFs. What's the relative level of risk? Then after you set those priorities, you need to say, where should we focus risk reduction efforts for a specific NCF? And then you kind of dive deeper down, what assets or systems are so critical to provision this national critical functions that if you cause anyone to go down, will have the most impact. So those are kind of things he has to be walking through. He needs also to understand, which national critical functions are most susceptible to a specific threat or hazard. And then he has to set kind of the outreach, the operational risk management priorities. Where should he focus his incident response or vulnerability management efforts? And then you also need to, I think, not sure if anyone touched on, assessing the impacts of kind of technology transition and emerging technologies. You have 5G, post-quantum algorithms coming. So how are these technologies coming into play now? And what is at risk more? So there's multiple layers he has to consider and ask himself. But again, the key thing is, developing those partnerships because they are so critical. They're mostly, for us, private sector owned. So therefore, we depend on these relationships. I'll give you one example, Colonial Pipeline incident. That was so critical in responding to something happening in the moment that we had to respond to. So those partnerships itself, we could call upon some of our friends, and we were able to work with some of the transportation fields, energy sectors, everything, because there's so many cascading effects. So those relationships and forged, collaborations will truly help him in the end too. But at the same time, I go back to, you can't solve, world hunger, boil the ocean here. So focus on the critical functions itself that, that if you disrupt them will have the most devastating effect, whether on security, economic security, public health, or safety, or just a combination thereof. So that I will offer that in the lens that we come in and how we tackle it at CISA.
Thank you. Absolutely. I think overall, we've heard prioritize, 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 and we start that process with understanding criticality and understanding the pieces of the risk puzzle. We're just about at time for our scenario tonight. Panelists, anyone else want to comment at all before I turn it back over to Barbara? Anything that we didn't cover tonight that you'd like to share with our participants? Okay. Well, audience, thank you. We will have the opportunity to discuss our topic each evening. So stay tuned. You'll get to hear what happens to Mr. Dingbang and his sector more tomorrow night. But Barbara, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Joanna. One quick question. We have these great responses from the audience. Will those be captured and we can share those with NCSA for them to share with all of the attendees?
Yes, they are captured.
Okay, great. Because I know some people were saying that the answers were going by so quickly they couldn't read them all, but we really want to capture all of that. And we really appreciate everyone's responses and thoughts. And want to encourage everyone to give their answers, because I think that all of the participants benefit from your perspectives as well as our perspectives. So as we come to close out this first session, first of all, thank you to all of you for your attention and listening and participating. We very much appreciate it. As we said early on, if you remember that house diagram that I shared, this is just the overarching piece. This is almost the roof over everything. And so the question is, for these next sessions, how do we find all those individual pieces that go into managing cybersecurity? And we learned important concepts tonight. Starting with the criticality assessment and how to do that and the different ways. Matt and Althea gave us different ideas on that. And then we talked about the whole risk evaluation process. And so understanding each of those steps and how to do that process. We know we went through very quickly tonight. So this is just the beginning, but it's to give you a sense of what the process looks like, how you would need to do it, and how it can actually help you do your job, just as Mr. Dingbang could benefit from having a strategic risk management process. Tomorrow night, we will move on to the session that will talk more about relationships between the critical infrastructure operators and building the bonds with NCSA. We'll start talking about how to build those kind of relationships. And so that will be, I think, a really interesting session to help you move forward on that. And while I'm talking here, there's one more question in Menti. As we mentioned at the very beginning, we had those objectives that we said that we were going to do. And so let me go back to the objectives slide. If I can bring back, bring up the objectives here. We said our objectives were, what are the benefits of a strategic risk management program? What are the different elements in a risk program? What is a risk register? How do you measure or score the elements of risk? And what are some of the other activities that support a strategic risk management program? So if you'll go into Menti and answer the question, did we meet our objectives with this session? We would appreciate your responses on that. And we'll give a minute or two for that. And if Joanna can tell us those responses.
Sure thing, Barbara. Put it up now. So far it looks positive. Vast majority of the respondents say yes, those objectives are met. A few said partially. We still have some votes are still coming in, only at about a little less than 40 votes. So we encourage you to respond. And we will keep this up and we'll close out this poll right away so you can respond as we finish out the session.
Well, and thank you again for your participation in our Mentimeter polls. It's very helpful for us to get your perspectives. And I know that NCSA would like to take a few minutes at the end here to provide their own perspective at the close of this session. So let me say again, Zawidaka, and we are very pleased that you are here, and we look forward to seeing you again tomorrow night. Thank you.
Barbara, can I
Yes.
speak a little bit to Thai participant?
Yes, it is. Yes, I'm turning it over to you now.
Thank you so much. First of all, I will talk in English and then I will talk in Thai. First, I would like to say thank you to you and your team. You work so hard for this. Thank you so much. And next, I will talk about the resources. If you can share the presentation, especially about the scenario about Ding Bang, so participants can read it more and study more. I will share the resource for them tonight. And so next I will speak in Thai. ก่อนอื่นนะครับก็ขอบคุณผู้แทนหน่วยงานทุกส่วนนะครับทั้งหน่วยงานควบคุมกำกับนะครับหน่วยงานของรัฐหน่วยงานโครงสร้างพื้นฐานสำคัญทางสารสนเทศผู้แทนของTB Cert ผู้แทนของโทรคม Cert นะครับที่เข้ามาร่วมกันฟังการอบรมวันนี้นะครับในส่วนของฟีดแบ็กต่างๆนะครับที่ทางผมกับทางทีมของทางฝั่ง Mitre นะครับถ้ายังมีส่วนไหนที่ท่านคิดว่าน่าจะสามารถปรับปรุงให้ดีขึ้นได้นะครับก็ขอให้ไม่ต้องเกรงใจนะครับแจ้งเข้ามาทางฝ่ายเลขาได้เลยนะครับพวกผมจะน้อมรับแล้วก็เอาไปปรับปรุงให้ดีขึ้นนะครับแล้วก็โอกาสสุดท้ายผมอยากให้ทุกท่านได้แสดงความขอบคุณกับทางทีมวิทยากรนะครับอยากให้ท่านช่วยพิมพ์แชทลงไปว่า thank you นะครับเพื่อที่ว่าทางทีมวิทยากรก็จะได้มีกำลังใจในการทำงานหนักดีๆแบบนี้ต่อไปนะครับก็ถ้าเกิดท่านไหนสะดวกก็สามารถพิมพ์แชทแสดงความขอบคุณได้ตั้งแต่ตอนนี้เลยนะครับall right Barbara that's all that I want to say to Thai people you can take control and summarize for this session please Barbara, can you hear me? Barbara, can you hear me? Don't forget to open your microphone. All right. I think she already gone. So I will end of this session. ถ้างั้นในวันนี้นะครับก็ขอขอบคุณทุกท่านนะครับที่เข้ามาร่วมการอบรมในวันแรกนะครับเดี๋ยวยังมีการอบรมอีกในวันถัดไปนะครับก็เดี๋ยวขอเชิญทุกท่านเข้ามาร่วมกันนะครับBarbara, can you Do you want to speak anything else?
Yes, thank you. I'm having difficulty with my computer and unmuting, so I apologize. So thank you very much tonight, and we look forward to continuing the next session tomorrow.
All right. Thank you so much, everybody. Bye bye.
Bye bye.
ครับฮัลโหลครับ
ครับมีใครจะพูดอะไรหรือเปล่าครับ
ครับผมจะถามว่า presentation ไฟล์วันนี้มีแชร์ให้ด้วยไหมครับ
ตอนนี้กำลังเมื่อกี้ขอทางคุณบาร์บาร่าไปแล้วครับเดี๋ยวทางผมจะ follow up ให้นะครับทุกท่านครับก็ทั้งในส่วนของ presentation ในส่วนของการบันทึกด้วยครับเดี๋ยวผมจะประสานเพื่อที่ว่าหลังจากวันนี้ใครอยากฟังซ้ำจะได้สามารถไปดูวิดีโอได้นะครับแต่ว่านี้ต้องขอเขาก่อนนะครับก็จะพยายามขอให้จะได้ไม่ได้อาจจะยังไม่ได้รับปาก 100% นะครับ
ได้ครับขอบคุณครับ
ครับยินดีครับ alright see you tomorrow bye bye